Fun thing. So welcome. I'm Sarah Maloney from the St. Joseph County Public Library. I'm the manager of research and technology. I will be moderating our chat this evening along with Rhonda Culbertson from the Franklin D. Schurz Library at Indiana University, South Bend. So attendees, if you need any assistance, please direct your questions in the chat. Rhonda will help you out. And we are thrilled to have Dr. Allison Head with us this evening. Allison is the author of Reading in the Age of Distrust, the April essay for Project Information Literacy, or PIL, the Provocation series. Dr. Head is the editor of the PIL Provocation series and the director of Project Information Literacy, and she is a senior researcher at the Metal Lab at Harvard. So tonight we will discuss what we can do to better prepare K through 12 students and the general public for civic literacy and for becoming deep and analytical readers. And we hope by forming partnerships between public and academic libraries, schools, and educators, and just interested people of all kinds, how can we encourage and improve close reading skills for both college-bound students and for the community as a whole. So I will start by asking Dr. Head some general questions, and to the audience, please feel free to type your own questions into the chat if you think of any while we're starting, and then later on we'll open up for audience Q&A, and you can ask your question then, have it in the chat. Just as a placeholder is fine. So with that, we will start. So Allison, why is reading important now, especially? Why has it become urgent? You know, reading is an age-old skill, but why do you see that it's become more urgent recently?
I think we're at an interesting intersection with reading, and it's why I wrote the essay. And we had seen some of the trends at Project Information Literacy over the last decade. But this was something that I felt needed more work, that we wanted to focus upon. Margie McMillan and Barbara Pfister, who were both here, we wrote a proposal a couple of years ago about reading. I really felt it was the unexplored topic around information literacy. So often we look at finding and using information in academic libraries. And the three of us got together and thought, reading's really fascinating. What's going on with reading, especially how it blends into these different areas of civic literacy. Now, the punchline is we wrote some proposals, and it was right after our news study that we did in 2018 that was funded by ACRL and also the Knight Foundation, which does a lot of media studies, new media studies. And program officers, I think, were confused. It was like, why reading? God, Allison, I mean, have you slipped over there reading? Doesn't everybody know about reading? And we continued to watch this topic of reading. We didn't get funding for that study. And we're kind of, crestfallen. We couldn't believe that we got turned down for something that was so important. Now, in the last couple of years, this is why I wrote the essay, we continued to monitor reading, and reading had become even more urgent in a time where there was a rise in so-called fake news. And we knew that from the news study that we did in 2018. The results from that study were from a survey of about 6,000 students at 8 colleges across the US, some in the Midwest, were startling. 36% of the sample said they didn't believe any news because of fake news. No news at all. That includes the New York Times and such. Another, probably my favorite comment out of that, the follow-up interviews we did as part of the news study, was a student that said, I spend more time trying to find an unbiased site than I do reading the news. So all of a sudden you see this process of reading get displaced. At the same time, sometime after the news study, we do the algorithm study. And the algorithm study is, again, with Barbara and Margie and I, and that comes out last year. And during the algo study, we find equally interesting things about how content is manipulated by algorithms. Not all algorithms are bad, but many are used to track readers and their clicks and their behaviors to sell ads, products, or really just to make decisions about them. They're used in libraries, academic libraries. There has been some research. Matthew Reedsma has talked about the use of algorithms in OPACs as well as databases to see how users are interacting with those resources. It's a double-edged sword. But coming out of that study, we really, and the news study, we pulled back and thought, reading is going through a transformation. And at the same time, it's always been the competency, the takeaway from college. College presidents talk about it. We train readers in college, deep analytical readers that can grapple with the world's problems. And if you think K through 12, again, reading is this, just this revered skill. And is it being ignored? Is it being ignored in light with what's happening as distrust grows in this country? The fake news result from our news study is one statistic. If you don't like that, or the sample's too small, Gallup did a study where 32%, or Swift did it for Gallup in 2016, 32% of the American public no longer trusted news. So you see this erosion to news more than ever in the readership of news. You also see algorithms filtering content and serving it up in ways that really change how users get information. So we continued to follow this trend, and I found it really fascinating. It's not just reading comprehension that students that we've studied at PIL struggle with. They're also skeptical. They're also cynical. In the algo study, one of my favorite quotes is one of the students said in a focus group, he expressed the ambivalence he had about algorithms. And he said, and algorithms spying on him and collecting his data. And he said, God, I mean, it's just a totalitarian hellscape. And I guess it's the best we can expect, though. And you see that incredible ambivalence of feelings about where we are with the information that we receive and how it's shaped and how it determines what we know about the world. COVID's yet another chapter. So it's these more recent trends that I think have made it more urgent, yet it's not getting the full attention that it should anywhere.
So it's beyond the need for just reading comprehension skills that are taught as a standard, in the curriculum, but now students or just all people need to have a deeper understanding beyond just the words they're reading, but understanding the context more.
I mean, context is everything,
Mm-hmm.
Sarah. I mean, context is the story. Somebody like Daniel Willingham, who's written a lot and conducted a lot of research out of UVA, had an op-ed in the New York Times. Barbara, I think you've got that citation, where he talks about the importance of context. And reading comprehension has been misunderstood, and that's why 2/3 of college students reportedly are unprepared for college reading. It's usually because they don't have the broader context about things that have occurred historically around them to read and understand the message. So here's an example. Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X. I assign that to you and you read it and you say, wow, it's really a heavy story. And then he's killed in 1965. Wow. But if you have no context of the civil rights movement or the racial strife that has occurred in this country around the Civil War, around slavery, around, or even Martin Luther King, that's a very different book for you to read and to understand. And in college, if I ask you, gee, be an analytical and deep reader, what's the message here? And you're going to give me a really simplified analysis because you don't have the historical context or appreciation for it or knowledge of it to be able to thoroughly process the message. So in the freshman study, I'm doing focus groups and students keep saying the same thing around reading comprehension and around reading comprehension. They keep using expressions like, I can't figure out the hook. I can't connect the dots. And there is a breakdown in education throughout. We look at we look at college, but we often talk about the K-20 continuum. And there is this breaking point between K-6 and play. And then all of a sudden, reading's not play anymore. Reading is something you do for the message and analysis and deeper meaning. And in high school, I found this fascinating in the freshman study. It's why I love what I do. One student said, you know, in high school, you read for an answer. The instructor always had the answer. And this is a student at Harvard talking to me in a one-on-one hour-long interview, first year at Harvard, says, yeah, I was in a class and I thought, wow, I really want to write about Shakespeare. I mean, did Shakespeare really write all these plays? How could he have? I mean, there's a debate about that, and I've read about that. So here this enterprising high school student wants to write about this and raises her hand in class as she tells the story. And the instructor says to her, look, at Shakespeare wrote all the plays. That's the answer. And that's what you're going to write about. So high school often is conditioned towards this answer, that there is an answer from the reading, and reading comprehension exams are built around that. Now fast forward to college, and you're in a college class, no matter where you go. We also study students from community colleges. And the instructor says, write a paper and tell me what it means. And you think, what's the answer? It's office hour. I taught for 25 years. I started out actually as a comp instructor at a community college, and office hour after office hour with students saying, but what are you looking for? What do you want in the essay? What do you want me to read for? In other words, your use of the word context. And this becomes a really different vicious circle, a tautological problem in college. So if you, let me see, let me do this for a minute because this is startling, and Sarah and I actually planned this. Here's a PDF, I hope. Oh, hold on. Let me see if I can do this. I'm trying to attach a file. I just have it on my desktop. Anyway, for lack of time, here's an interesting finding. We do the study, now fast forward. We've studied college students as they enter college. I was talking about the freshman study, but we've also studied college students once they graduate and during their years in college. So we've done 12 different studies. All of them were large scale. We've interviewed over 21,000 students. So we got a lot of data about college. And we have some data about reading, but we're really focused on finding and using information. So we do this study, get a federal grant from IMLS. We do a 2-year study. It's a study I've always wanted to do. What happens after college, the day after college? You know, what skills do you take from you, information skills or practices do you take from you from college? And what we find when we ask a question around these basic skills with a matrix that we develop for habits of mind, information practices, information literacy. It's kind of a little blend that we use. And we find that 76% of the students or recent grads out of 1,651 that we interview say, I can use information. I can apply it towards something. And maybe finding an apartment or finding a job or opening a bank account. And then 72% say, I can search for information. I can find things, usually probably talking about Google. And then, if you're ready, 27% of the sample says, I didn't really develop the ability to ask questions of my own. And that is a really important part of the equation of reading. If you're not asking questions of your own, if you're second guessing what an instructor wants, your reading experience is limited and your comprehension. You're looking for answers. It's a different kind of game.
So is maybe one solution or direction to try moving away from emphasizing a right answer or being right about a question and trying to cultivate more of like a curiosity in people and just somehow getting people interested in exploring all of the sides instead of this emphasis on, you know, grades and testing and there's a right answer?
Yeah, I think where we're at now with reading, I come back to Marianne Wolf and her writings, and I think there'll be a link on that as well. Marianne Wolf, who studied reading a lot, she's a neuroscientist. She was at Tufts for years. She's now at UCLA. She's done a number of really interesting studies about reading. And what she concludes is, and I like this matrix for defining deep reading and analytical reading and what we're talking about today. What she talks about is really there are 4 different kinds of things we want to convey around reading as instructors or parents or whomever. The first is a cognitive understanding, a thinking understanding. I think K through 12 is good at that. For the most part, I get the message, whether that's an instructor's answer or whatever it is. I can think about this. And then the second one is perceptive. And that is, I can understand the meaning and how this means and why I'm reading it for, I'm reading Malcolm X for my American Civ class. That makes sense. Okay, I know enough to be able to perceive the meaning and again, its context. But this last one we're not very good at. And that is effective, the effective message of reading. In other words, how's it make you feel? In simple parlance. If you read Malcolm X's story, how do you relate to it? Is this part of your lived experience? Is this entirely different than anything you have experienced? What's it remind you of? In other words, how can you internalize it to make it memorable, to make it part of your world and your lived experience? This has incredible implications for education around racial literacy and where we started, fake news. If you really start thinking about how you think about it, how it means, just the cognitive and perceptive, but then also the emotional level that it reaches you on. The forgotten piece with deep reading that's being talked about more and more, and we talk about it in the essay, talk about Kathleen Fitzpatrick's book around generous reading that she came up with last year or 2 years ago. What we talk about is empathy. A big part of reading has always been to make you more empathic. When we have a Smart Talk interview series, and I love it because we can go to people that know more than us. We do a study and we think, God, I wish I could have said this, or I wonder how, what's the opinion behind this? Because I'm a social science researcher. We make recommendations, but we don't really hold forth. We might write an op-ed or something to get, some eyes on some different issues. But often we'll do a Smart Talk series and an interview with somebody that is really a leading thinker in an area we're studying, whether that's the transition to high school or college preparedness. But one of my favorite, and in fact, a lot of people use it still, was an interview with Ken Bain, the renowned educator who wrote What the Best College Teachers Do. And if you've ever taught college, you probably know this book because it's handed around to give you, did tons of interviews and then really summarized, how are you effective in class? How do you come across? How do you reach students? How do you have impact and help them grow and want to change their lives in maybe a future direction, what they want to do? I mean, that's really the winning formula, I think. But when we interviewed him, I asked him, this was years ago, it's like 2012, and I asked him about reading. He had just written a new book about what the best college students did. Different topic, not professors, college students. And what I asked him was, what are these people that you've interviewed for years, these college students that did well? They've gone on with their life, they got it. They may have not been A students, but they really became leaders. They took that experience somehow and translated it to their lives. It empowered them, regardless of grades, regardless of majors, regardless of kind of what they did. They had impact in society. And he said something profound. He said, most students, the folks that I interviewed in that sample, they were voracious readers. They were avid readers. Okay, it doesn't come as a surprise, but what follows makes sense here in talking about Marianne Wolf's matrix. And that is that not only were they voracious readers, they connected everything they read to their lives. And in other words, they took that affective step. They thought about it, they thought about the meaning, and then they thought, what's this mean in my life? Whether they rejected it and thought, this is not me, or whether they embraced it and it led them farther on their journey. In other words, reading, really experiencing reading from that perspective and making those connections. If you come back to that young Harvard student who said, I'm having trouble connecting the dots. Students have trouble connecting dots no matter where they go to school, because we often don't do a good enough job to help them see that there are dots to be connected. We don't give them a map. There are many examples that have come up in our research, which I find really fascinating. There are also examples that we do where we score, where we help.
So I know that you are, your research focuses a lot on college students, higher ed, and we have several people here tonight in our audience who work with younger students or maybe even adult learners. So we know that, not everyone goes to college. Um, do you think that these deeper reading skills and connecting what you read to your life and making those connections are important for people who don't go to college, or older people who maybe have already gone to college? Have they just missed their chance to learn this?
Absolutely not. I contend all people are learners. Just like high school, I'm going to come back to something here. Just like high school, we don't leave students with knowledge that they need to ask questions of their own. That would be a good lesson to send them on their way if they intend to go to college, or if they intend to go on in life and not go to college and maybe be a learner later on. I think the lesson in college that we found out in the lifelong learning study was there was never a mention of lifelong learning in information literacy. Everything is focused. I see you shaking your head and in agreement. If you really think about it, it's pretty fascinating. Those skills are really focused often on how to succeed in college, and how to find peer-reviewed resources for fulfilling assignments, and how to pass courses and write papers. And that is not to say that librarians don't know this, or haven't made changes. However, when we did the lifelong learning study, I was pretty floored that lifelong learning never comes up in information literacy, as far as you will graduate from here and go on and learn. Now, this is where it intersects with your question and what you were asking me about. When we did the study of lifelong learners, there's an interesting comparison here. When we did the study of lifelong learners, we found 45%, this will warm your heart, Sarah, 45% were public library users. Within the first year or two, within the first year, on a yearly basis, 45% had turned to the public libraries. They had had a ton of questions that college didn't prepare them to answer or didn't teach them. And this is like the person who doesn't go to college. These are very similar information needs around life skills, often around financial abilities, even how to balance a checkbook, how to read a lease if you're lucky enough to find an apartment these days, and how to protect yourself there, how to have a job interview. When we did a study, we actually have studied folks that haven't gone to college indirectly. We did, with Columbia University, we did a project that I loved that ended up not getting additional funding, which happens to us not very often, but once in a while. And this was to make something, and it was called the Reading List for Life. And the Reading List for Life was there. I don't know if you know this or anyone here knows it. Raise your hand if you do. There's a resource, open access, called the Open Syllabus Project. And a lot of folks know it. Actually, it was developed while I was a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. And I developed it with Dennis Tenen, a colleague. I have to give him credit. He was a computer programmer and developed about 80% of it. And it was a really cool, ambitious program, little app for looking at syllabi and from around the world. And he really had this vision of what the Open Syllabus Project could be. There are now 2 million syllabi in the Open Syllabus Project. So we were working with Columbia. Dennis is now a professor there, and Joe Cardenas has taken over the project. Dennis and I always envisioned that something should be made from the open syllabus project. And bear with me because it's a good story. When I was a professor, the school where I was at a liberal arts school, they said, well, again, the question, you have these career questions. What happens to students after college? And so we did a focus group. This was before PIL. This was before my research study. And there was a student I'd had in class. I have to say, not my best student, showed up. I was surprised. I couldn't believe he had an interest. I couldn't believe he ever wanted to see me again. But there he was in my focus group. And we were talking about surprises when you graduate from college. And he said, and everybody kind of looked because he always said very unpredictable things. I know when I had him in my class, he said, nobody gives you the reading list for life. I thought, God, that's profound. I mean, that there would be one, and what would be on it? And how could that even be a document? And then he paused and he said, so here's my question. Did this college teach me the wrong things to read? Because when I go out to lunch with people, he was also very literal. When I go out to lunch with people, they talk about books I didn't read in college that they read. And I thought, wow. I mean, that's so interesting that you would think there is a canon. Although if you look closely at reading in English departments, depending where you go to college, there is a canon of things that are on the reading list for life that is greatly debated. So this became kind of the impetus for this project. If we developed a prototype, back to the open syllabus project, if we developed a prototype that could be used in public libraries and could help learners and not just college grads, if we could help learners, because those of you that work in public libraries know, here's what we discovered in our interviews. We did 2 idea-a-thons on both coasts, Seattle Public Library with public librarians, talking about reading and reading habits in public libraries with college grads, but really more with adult learners, continued learners, really lifelong learners, a real mix that were adults and certainly past, I think our cutoff point was like 10th or 11th grade, and all the way to 80. Who do you get in your public libraries? And what we found, one of the biggest problems that librarians had was public librarians was being able to feed that beast and their curiosity. The adjectives that came up over and over again is that readers that used public libraries, here were the 3 adjectives. They were curious, they were persistent, and they were practical. And often they wanted, I love this term from public librarians, explainer books. And that could be everything. If you do reference, you probably know this, everything from GEDs to being able to get a driver's test, to being able to sign up to vote. So they needed explainer books, as well as this very different category as we developed this reading prototype, which was this category of surprised me. They were on a journey, and reading was, and learning and lifelong learning was iterative, and reference librarians who were often consulted would help them on that journey. Now, the punchline is that we found the same thing with college grads that used libraries, public libraries, once they had finished their education. Like the other lifelong learners in this huge category that librarians were explaining, we found that college learners, we had this data, we don't have it actually on the Ideathon because we weren't collecting survey data. from those public librarians. But what we knew from the lifelong learning study wasn't foreign to us about what we were finding from what we had found in the lifelong learning study. And what we found was that those students grads who had used public libraries that had graduated from college, they were 5 times more likely to use a reference librarian in their public library. At the time, I thought, well, it's because it's a college habit, I guess. But is it? Not really. If you talk to students, most students don't use reference librarians. So reference librarians play this powerful role. I think that link between reading and reference librarians in public libraries and libraries is really profound and fascinating, and a key around civic literacy and a key to lifelong learning, and tremendously important at a time where public library budgets, as you all know, are being cut. And you know, it is that link. It's probably the strongest link with lifelong learning, given the trust in libraries as institutions that occurs year over year in Pew studies, as well as the usage. Half the population has used a public library in the last year. So there's a similarity, I think, between college grads using public libraries and around civic literacy and lifelong learners at large. Last thing, the beast you're feeding. I found this fascinating in the idea-a-thon. Librarians said, you know, it takes about 5 hours to work with this kind of reader. In other words, it's incredibly time intensive, yet they are the repeat visitors of libraries and really the true lifelong learner and lifelong reader that you find.
Thank you for all that, those pro-library comments. Love to hear it.
But it's true. There really isn't any place else.
Yep. So we have a lot of great questions that have come through in the chat. So we would like to now open it up for audience Q&A. So Rhonda, if you have you found maybe one question to start us off, and then we would invite audience, you can unmute yourself if you want to ask your question out loud, or we will just keep pulling from the chat.
Yes, and it would have so many wonderful comments. It's hard to pick one, but a couple of things that in the later comments, you talking about lifelong learning and sort of use of public libraries. And there's been lots of questions about leisure reading and how leisure reading can sort of be part of this program. Stuff that we're reading just to please ourselves, but is that part of this whole program?
What's the role here? I always come back to the data. I'm a researcher. It's what I do. I have lots and lots of findings, and but here's a good one, and you'll like it. And this caused a line at ALA when I spoke at their national conference at New Orleans that stretched all the way down the aisle and out the door with aghast librarians. When I said, here are early findings from our new study. I was actually very pleased with myself at the time. It was like we had administered this study at 10 different colleges and had over 6,000 different survey respondents. Here's what, I'm going to tease this. Here's what we're finding. You know what's really fascinating is students are getting a lot of their news. Hold on. Students are getting a lot of their news from memes. And you could just see this ripple move through the audience. And I found it really interesting that students would see memes as being an information resource. So we really, the nice thing with mixed methods is we chase that in our lifelong learning studies. I mean, in our follow-up interviews. With students in the new study with a subsample randomly selected. And we said, why memes? You know, I think I've got an X on my back at ALA, why memes? And their response was, because it helps me what I do is they amuse me. And remember, this is administered in 2017, Trump's president. There's a lot of content. There were a lot of memes at the time. There's a lot of news and a lot of political news, but it is something that I can learn from. And what I do is I dig deeper to get the joke. And again, back to Sarah's comment, which was really smart in the beginning, to get the context. What's the punchline? And if you really think about it, satire has always been a part of reading and entertainment and pleasure reading. So I found that interesting. I don't have a hard time with, and I know folks do, and I actually have it on my list of do nots. And you can tell from the essay that I wrote, I think there's a real danger in saying, and some researchers do, have a binary relationship with digital reading and print. Always read the book. Always wait till it comes out, and and you can get a copy of the book. Don't ever read things online. I just don't think that's realistic. And I think that's another part of the leisure reading. So much of it is available online, whether those are, different graphic novels for students for learning, which have gained in popularity, or whether those are, God forbid, memes. If you start using, you come back. I mean, Marianne Wolf's analysis, that matrix is a brilliant little roadmap to think about defined reading and how you would approach it. You could take a meme and you could say, what do you think about it? What's it mean? If you think about lateral reading, where there's a lot of talk about this as a skill of looking at different sources to get a greater context, what does it mean? And why is it relevant now to you and your world? How do you incorporate this into your greater understanding? I think it could be a very powerful tool, as is a lot of leisure reading. And I think book clubs you're in an academic setting, Rhonda, although it's not your question, but you're in an academic setting. Book clubs in academic libraries for leisure reading, as well as public libraries, have been tremendously successful, especially in recent years. But public libraries around COVID, where people really need to connect, come back to Ken Bain, they made connections across their lives. So I'm not a picky reader.
Just made me think that's a great idea for collaboration between academic and public libraries. More
There's lots of
collaborative
collaboration.
reading groups.
Yeah, we did have another question about expertise. This person wanted to know how to interact with others who are not academic or haven't been to college, and helping them to understand why expertise is something that should be respected and listened to, and that not denigrating people for not having that higher level of education, but still sort of impressing on them why that is so important.
Yeah, I love that question, and I get asked that a lot. I think there are lots of answers I could give to it, but probably one of my favorite examples comes from the field during the lifelong learning study and doing a follow-up interview with a recent grad. And I remember she lived in Hawaii, and she had to make, like, I think she took medical samples or something around to different islands. And she was talking about that job. She had a science background. And she said, I work with, she's in a small community. And she said, not everybody went to college that I work with. And, I was kind of listening. And she said, and I try to explain the science behind this. And this is going to come full circle here. I try to explain the science behind this and what we're trying to do with these samples and the work we're trying to advance as a biologist. And she said, and they say, you know where I'm going, but what's the answer? And I think that's fascinating, because if you really think of where I started, of high school focuses a lot on the answer, that when I kind of probed this interviewee further, she said, it's not black and white. And I guess that's what college teaches you, is the gray, the spectrum of gray. And if you really want the gray spectrum, go to grad school, and then, or specialize and become an expert. And then you'll have the complete spectrum of gray. But I think that's a real interesting take about your question, person who asked it, which is a great question, about expertise. And what is the value of expertise, and what do you take from expertise? And why is something that we've talked a lot about? I know Barbara Pfister and I talked, I know she's probably over there smiling and shaking her head in agreement. What makes somebody an expert? And Margie and I have talked about that too. And how do you learn that? These are really critical literacy questions. Who gets to speak? And why do they? We did a study last year on COVID and the first 100 days of news coverage that came out in September. And one of the questions we looked at through coding and analysis of over 125,000 news stories and a subset of about 66,000, was who has the megaphone, who's managing your attention, and who is an expert, and how do they get to be an expert, and what makes them an expert? I think that's a fascinating question, and one that we should be asking now, especially around news, and especially around what to believe, and who has that validity and why.
Yeah, and there is another one that I was interested to hear your response to. It was about sort of the change of style in teaching, that active learning has been sort of really emphasized at the expense of traditional lecture, reading, note-taking. Have we swung the pendulum too far, perhaps, in that pedagogy?
Yeah, I love that. I think about it a lot. My PhD, I got my PhD 30 years ago. My PhD's from Berkeley, a very quantitative institution. And I'm laughing because I'm trained to always talk about the findings, and I'm trained to always lecture. That's, that was the prize when I got my PhD, especially at an institution like Berkeley, to be, the sparkling lecturer, and to know all the different research and weave it all together, and to be able to come up with the takeaway. And I was at Harvard for 9 years as a fellow, and there was a lot of that too. I fit in well in that environment. But there also, I interviewed Rob Liu at Harvard, actually. He's also one of our Smart Talks on active learning. And he has a science background. And we talked about, is there room? Again, I go to experts to ask these questions myself because they fascinate me. Is there room for lecture, please, lecture and also active learning? And in science, how do you balance that? And I loved it. He talked about, his class was always overbooked. Everybody wanted to take him. He really was very charming and just a really interesting person. And he said, with active learning, here's an example. The first day you get these students in, I think it was biochem or something. And he said, Oh, it looks like Fred's sick. He came in and here's his sample. Let's look at his blood. And he had a test tube and said, wow, what's wrong with Fred? We need to figure that out. And it turned out to be a kind of cancer. And that's what the first lecture was about, up until the class had done the activity and analyzed the results. And he said, and at that point, then I worked in the theory and the lecture around that. And I thought it was a great example of how those two things can exist. You know, is the pendulum swinging too far? Are we looking too critically at the canon? Are we saying, oh, gee, you know, we shouldn't teach Huck Finn or Catcher in the Rye? I was talking to somebody young the other day, said, I really wanted to read Catcher in the Rye, and it was pulled from our high school list. And I said, why don't you read it on your own? And she said, well, I didn't really think of it. Again, that's the expertise of somebody defining your reading list for life. You can see I've been thinking about all these threads and how they tie together. Bless you.
Well, Sarah, we're at 6:22. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I don't know if Barbara, is that your last question? Or I'm sorry, Allison, is that your last question?
I can take one more, and then I know you want to do a wrap up of how can we work together within the community. So it's your call.
Yeah, is there one more, Rhonda, that you think was kind of a good meaty one? Or
Really good ones.
Well, we better do one more then. One more.
Let's see. Well, there was a lot of conversation around your point about teaching readers to ask questions and not be necessarily looking for answers or the answer, but how to sort of the number of comments on how we encourage as teachers students to, you know, look for the questions or to ask good questions.
Yeah, you know, this follows, it's not just me. This follows into, we did I love this study as well. There's so many studies we've done that I love their direction and what we were hoping to find out. We did a study on the workplace, and we interviewed employers, and what was it like to work with recent college grads. It was funded by IMLS as well a few years ago. And one of the interviews were fascinating. I always wanted to say to the employer, where are you? You're talking this candidly about your hires. They really went into a lot of depth and just a lot of detail. But one of the complaints, and I talk about it in the essay, was when I give a student, a recent grad, a question, they're very quick. And when we interviewed grads, by the way, in focus groups, they said, they hired me because I'm very quick. So there was a disconnect that they had never solved, which was kind of fascinating. But they were very quick, and what grads looked for was some sort of answer that was a solution, and more importantly, that was in synthesis form, so that they didn't have to synthesize what they had found. And the web did that for them. Very well. So, this extends beyond college. It also extends into the workplace as well. And the kinds, you can say all you want about college preparing somebody for the workplace. What are we preparing really by how we're kind of moving through this curriculum? And it sounds like employers aren't happy.
I think that seems like a closing thought then from you, thinking about what this means post-college, if you've gone to college. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing all your research and knowledge and all of the information in the chat.